Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the ATI webinar on the history of travel training. My name is Christy McLaughlin, and I am on the ATI board. I'm also the co-chair for the Professional Development Committee, which is responsible for the presentation of the webinar today. Just a couple of housekeeping items that we'll get out of the way before I turn the session over to our presenter. We are recording today's session, so it will be available on the ATI website within probably about a week. It takes us a little time to get that recording converted over and put onto the site, but we'll do that just as quickly as we can. So if you have colleagues that were unable to attend today, we will have that available on the site for anybody to watch after the session is over within about a week. But that also means, just FYI, for those of you that are on the session, the chat section is public. It's going to be available for people to view after the session is over, so just keep that in mind for any comments that you do post or questions that you ask at the end of the session. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. You can submit your question in one of two ways. You can either submit your question in the chat box in the webinar room, or there's an actual Q&A box that you can also access in the webinar room. I'm going to be monitoring both of those, and we'll make sure that Peggy gets those questions at the end of the session, no matter which way you submit them. So you have both ways as an option. Also, before we start the session, I did want to mention that for anybody that is on the call that is not currently an ATI member, this is a great time to start thinking about possibly signing up for membership for next year. Membership runs from January through December, so we're getting very close to either renewal dates for people that are current members or a great time to sign up for anybody that's not currently a member. The individual membership is quite a deal, I think. You can sign up for $50 for the year and get access to free webinars, other professional development opportunities. We allow for discounts to registration for the annual conference for members. There's a members only portion of the website where resources are located. And then the Professional Development Committee specifically, as well as other committees within ATI, have been working on additional opportunities for members for the upcoming year. We're not quite ready to announce what those are going to be yet, but I do think that everybody's going to be pleased with the opportunities that we're going to be able to provide for members to connect with each other and also obtain additional information. So, if you're not currently a member, I strongly suggest that you consider that. And again, membership runs from January through December, so this is a great time to start thinking about signing up for the 2019 year. So with that, I'm not going to make you wait any longer. I'm happy to have with us today Peggy Groce, who is the former Director of Travel Training at the New York City Department of Education. She's also one of the founding members of ATI and a past president of ATI, and I just can't think of another person that is better prepared to discuss the topic at hand today, which is not only the history of travel training, but the history of the disability movement, which she will tell you is pretty much something that can't be separated from the history of travel training because of the nature of travel training. So, with that, I'll allow Peggy to do a little bit of an additional introduction of herself, but I'm not going to make you wait any longer, and I'll turn the session over to Peggy.
Good afternoon. I'm so glad we're all here together. I'm a person who is very fond of musicals, particularly old musicals. And in The Sound of Music with Julie Andrews, there is a song that says, "Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could." And that's sort of the theme of the way this History of Travel Training webinar is designed. Because, next slide please, the lens we use matters. If nothing comes from nothing, because it never could, where did travel training come from? It cannot be separated from the lives of people with disabilities throughout the centuries in America and in the world. And currently, or in disability history, in the disability rights movement, they use the concepts of models, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And there's the moral charity model, where you're going to take care of, or you had a child with a disability because you are so saintly, or because someone in your family sinned, and you should always have pity on and take care of the person with the disability. Some people felt the telethons that used to be on were part of this model. Then in the late 19th century, coming out after the Civil War, we moved towards the concept of a defective or medical model. And that was, you are defective if you have a disability. And eugenics became very big. And actually, the eugenics movement in the United States was studied very closely by the Germans in the Nazi period. And we did a lot of forced sterilization of people that were considered feeble-minded, insane, or otherwise unable to contribute positively to society. And they were a drag on society. That is the period when institutionalization became big, and we began to put people away so they would not be seen or annoy other people. And it was at this time, and starting in our great city of San Francisco, that the ugly laws came into being, which basically indicated if you were so distasteful to others, you should not be out and you could be arrested and not be able to be out in public. After the period of institutionalization coming to an end, where the medical model of being defective and needing to be fixed came, rehabilitation became a major thing, particularly after World War II. And it was still based on the model of the professional being the person who will identify what is wrong with you, fix what is wrong with you, and you needed a professional to be able to get any kind of help or service. And this can be seen still within the current education law under the concept of related services, which follow a medical model of diagnosis, periods of time for therapy, and two of the more notable rehabilitation models are orientation and mobility and occupational therapy. By the 1950s and early 1960s, a new model came. Was the social model of looking at disability or the independent living model? And that is where travel training was born. Next slide. Just to give you pictures of it, on the top corner, the man with the hat out would be the moral charity model. The man in the middle is Associate Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in a famous Buck versus Bell case where he said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough and ordered forced sterilization. Then you have the wheel depicting the feeble-minded as the source of crimes and problems. On the left, there is a picture of a young man in an institution where they sat all day and did nothing. And in the middle, you see rehabilitation, where you're going to be fixed and prepared and be able to make some form of contribution. Then finally, you have a group of people with disabilities proclaiming loudly as they stop the bus, "I can't even get to the back of the bus." So they were part of the whole evolution of models that gave birth to travel training. Next slide. We'll look at it through the period of decades. In the 40s and 50s, there were stirrings. In the 60s, there were rumblings. The 70s, you could say it was a clamoring. The noise got so loud. In the 1980s, they were demanding, and the activists were saying, we will accept nothing else. In the 1990s, there was an acclamation of we have arrived, we have achieved. And then in the 2000s, the total realization we have to continue our struggle because it ain't over yet. We still have a lot to overcome. Next slide. In the world of disability rights and in the world of the United States, there was a lot of stirring after World War II. In 48, Truman desegregated the military because the veterans who came back were no longer willing to have segregated units for African Americans and white members of the military. In 1948, at the University of Illinois, they established housing for veterans with disabilities so they could get into the buildings with ramps. In 1949, 1950, there was the National Association for Retarded Citizens that came together in Minneapolis. There was righteous anger after the war that all of these people who had fought in the war to free people in Europe, to free people in the Pacific, in China, in East Asia, that when they came home, their children were expected to live and die in institutions, that they were expected to not be able to, if they lost a limb in the war, if they lost their vision or their hearing, they were not supposed to be able to go to school. So there was an outrageous righteousness that rose up in the people. What did we fight for if not here at home? So you also had Brown versus Board of Ed, which opened the door to desegregating public schools. And the Vocational Rehab Act was expanded to include people with disabilities. And it was the first instance of the Social Security Disability Program. Of particular interest in travel training was the establishment in 1958 of a half-day program called an Occupation Day Center in New York City for adults with mental retardation. That was the term at the time. And it was successful, and then there was some funding in 1959 for it to become a full-day program. That's one of the most significant things in the history of travel training. How did that start? Next slide. On the left, there is an ad that a parent put in the newspaper, Anne Greenberg, in 1949. Are there any other parents out there who have a retarded child? Would you be interested in meeting and talking about this with another parent? Anne's son had been born while her husband was fighting in the war. I think he was fighting in Europe. She did not tell him because she did not want to worry him with additional concerns while he was trying to stay alive, that their child had developmental disabilities. There was nothing around for young kids like him. So she put an ad in. So many responded, it became the start of the New York City chapter for the Association of Retarded Children. Next to it is a report, which I'll get into in the next slide, Training for Independent Living, a community program for mentally retarded adults. It was in 1962, and it was based on what had gone on at the Occupation Day Center. And a high feature of it is what you see in the pamphlet titled Teaching Trainables to Travel. That came out of that program and out of that report. Next slide. The 1960 presidential election was remarkable for a number of reasons. Forget the fact that it was a young, good-looking John F. Kennedy. Forget the fact it was the first Catholic president. It was the first president who proclaimed the concept of having a member of the family with mental retardation. It came out of the closet. It made a very, very loud noise. The 1960s were filled with a whole lot of loud noises. There were two polio epidemics I did not mention, one in the 40s and one in the 50s, that had a tremendous impact on the disability rights movement, as many of the leaders of it had had polio. President Kennedy brought developmental disabilities to the forefront. At the same time, in 1962, Ed Roberts went to the University of California at Berkeley, and the rolling quads came into existence. The Civil Rights Act, established and done with the activists of the civil rights movement that we all know about, the three of them in 64, 65, and 68, they did not include people with disabilities. They used race, they used gender, they used sex, but they did not include or specifically state that people with disabilities were included in the rights to non-discrimination, to being able to vote. They were not in there. The National Institute for the Deaf at the Rochester Institute of Technology was established in the 60s. It should be noted that in the early 1800s, schools for the deaf and schools for the blind had been established early on as separate entities. So I'm not going to be talking about their part in the disability rights movement and in travel training, with the exception of something that happened at Gallaudet. In 1966, Christmas in Purgatory was published. If you haven't seen it, it's worth taking a look at. Burton Blatt was a gentleman who had become mesmerized by the lives of people who had developmental disabilities and the way they were confined and treated in the institutions and by the society in America. And he created with another person, I think it was Freda Kaplan or somebody Kaplan, a book of pictures, Christmas in Purgatory. And it shows what we thought and how we treated people. In 1965, Robert F. Kennedy visited an institution in New York City called Willowbrook, and he said, I think that at the State Institution for the Mentally Retarded, and I think that particularly at Willowbrook, we have a situation that borders on a snake. It was not an issue with the developmentally disabled necessarily of physical access. There were many other issues. In 1968, Fred Fay was one of the big pushers for the Architectural Barriers Act, which was the first, I think it was the first major thing to create access for people with disabilities. And it was an amazing, amazing achievement. That goes back to 68. But in 1960s, for travel training, for the profession, that was the year of the eruption and the emergence of travel training for people with developmental disabilities throughout the United States. Next slide. For those of you who don't know, which is probably most of us, the gentleman in the red shirt is Jack Gorelick, and we like to call him the founder of travel training. And we have the Gorelick Award at ATI, which Kevin Milch was awarded this year in 2018. And next to him is Billy Conklin. This was taken about 10 years ago. And Billy was in his 60s then, and Jack was up there also. Now, Billy was the first person at the Occupation Day Center in New York City to receive travel training. The very first one, and he was in his 20s. He was the son of a state senator, and Jack, who was the director, was able to convince them to give it a chance. because he told him, if you do it, he told the senator, if you do it, other parents will also. Billy has Down syndrome, and he had to take 2 subways to get home from the borough of Manhattan to the borough of Queens. Billy learned to travel, and it opened the floodgates throughout. If anybody were going to do a little story, that would be a great human interest story. And in the history of AHRC, the historian David Good wrote, Jack Gorelick is probably exactly right in his analysis that post-World War II America was such a society that a parents' movement could take form. Jack called the parents' movement a groundswell, a popular movement. It's almost like spontaneous combustion. The time comes and it's going to happen. You have the Holocaust, people away for a long time in the service. And when the GIs came out, they were not going to take from anybody. That was Jack, and that was probably true. The war had a tremendous unsettling effect on established norms and ways of looking at things. The people who came back as veterans did not want to be considered defective. They had fought. They did not want their children considered defective. So it was a major ground change that was coming from people, not from leaders. Movements seldom come from leaders. They come from those who really feel what is necessary and what they have to do. Jack talks about the beginning of travel training. And I happened to work there in the early 60s. And I remember seeing some of what he was talking about. One of the primary reasons the staff felt it should be tried, and it had not been tried with, travel training had not been tried with people who were considered to have this level of disability before, but the parents would come in the morning, sit all day in the lobby of the building, and wait in the afternoon to take their sons and daughters home. And they were in their 60s and 70s, and staff felt bad. And that is why they decided to go the route they went to see, can they learn to travel? What would it take for them to learn to travel? Next slide. It was very effective, and it spread. Now, these are day activity centers that were spread by parents, primarily through the ARC, the National ARC. In 1964, there were 68 programs nationally. 12% of them offered travel training. 69% said you had to travel for admission, and that was usually to a sheltered workshop. And only 30% provided transportation because you didn't have funding for it, and they had to raise money to get charter service. By 1971, there were 422 programs. That's more than 6 times the amount in 7 years. 45% offered travel training. 3% required travel for admission, but 55% provided transportation. You can see from these figures that travel training was going completely across the country into these programs for adults who had significant levels of what was then termed mental retardation. Most of them would have, when they were using an IQ to determine classifications, had IQs below 50. That was not considered a deterrent. This was the beginning of travel training. It had an enormous impact in the lives of everyone, and that is why it spread so. Next slide. The 1970s, boy, did the noise get loud. You had the Urban Mass Transit Act, which most transit systems in the United States ignored, but it required purchasing new vehicles that would be accessible. Judy Heumann in New York City, the East Coast, was the equivalent of Ed Roberts on the West Coast in independent living. The first Center for Independent Living occurred in Berkeley, California. The 1973 Rehabilitation Act was passed, but they did not do the regulations. And so by 1977, under a new president, it was Jimmy Carter, after Nixon, they organized a sit-in across the country. And there were sit-ins at federal buildings in a number of major cities. But in San Francisco, they sat in for 28 days. People with severe disabilities sat in the federal office for 28 days. It was big national news. And they did that until the regulations were passed. Around the same time, the Atlantis community was formed in Denver to go for community living. Public Law 94-142, which is now Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, passed. No mention of travel training in it. There was mention of providing transportation as a related service, but no mention of teaching how to use it. Big error. And at the same time, the Atlantis community began to sit in blocking several Denver buses. The disability community had come to the realization that it was absolutely essential to focus a bit of time on transit, because transit was essential if you wanted employment, to get in and out of your house to the store, to have recreation, to go to school, to do anything, to live and participate in the community. You had to be able to move around. So they focused on transportation as an issue. In 1970, travel training began in the New York City public schools. To the best of my knowledge, it is the longest and largest continuously operating travel training program in the Western world. I could be wrong. If anybody else can correct that, please let me know. But it had started in 1970, particularly to serve those youngsters with mental retardation who could not travel to school and would have to learn how to travel to continue in school until the age of 21. In 1973, travel training was started in the Pittsburgh public schools. It was started by an orientation and mobility specialist who was bringing in O&M methodology. The primary difference between that methodology and the travel training in public schools in New York was that in New York, it did not have the academic requirements or constraints that were in the O&M model. The program in New York trained its own personnel. What also happened in 1973, the state of Ohio's programs for the Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities instituted travel training in their programs throughout the state. This is monumental, absolutely monumental. I cannot think of another state or another OMRDD office that did such a thing. It also had some roots in O&M, but I think that changed over time. But it was monumental that in all of their programs, they would provide the service of travel training, or in many of their programs, to adults with developmental disabilities. This was a huge step. In New York, something that we hear about all the time now, and at an ATI conference in Minneapolis a couple of years ago, there was a police officer who came to speak to the participants about the police dealing with adults or travelers who have disabilities. In 1973 in New York, it was realized, because they had started early, there had to be collaboration. There had to be new procedures for police to follow when they came across an adult with a developmental disability or a non-visible disability. And there had to be procedures that a provider of service could follow to inform the police. Prior to that time, an individual with a disability had to be missing, if they were over 18, had to be missing for 48 hours, and a report could only be filed by a family member. That had to change if there were going to be widespread movement of people throughout the country. That became a sort of a model. At the same time, in '75, the MTA in New York City began, that's the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and the New York City Transit System did give in and provide mobility passes for travel trainers in the New York City Board of Ed program so that they would not have to pay when they were in the process of training someone to travel. And the reason that is they were able to get well-trained passengers, and they were also able to help reduce the cost for a sister agency, the Department of Education. Of significance, in '78, '79, the University of Wisconsin initiated a training program to train people interested in orientation and mobility to be able to expand that to people with other disabilities. So this was showing, along with the Laos program in Pittsburgh in '73, the growing interest of orientation and mobility professionals in moving into providing orientation and mobility to people with other disabilities. So that program lasted, I think it only had one graduating class, and they did come into New York to spend time to give their students some experience with people who were actually doing it. That program did not last for a long time, but it set in motion what later came to be the program that was involved in the founding of Association of Travel Instructors, okay? So these things are all connected over time. Also, very important for the concept of travel training. There was a study done that took a couple of years in New York City Department of Education program, and the program received a certificate of validation. It was proven that the design of the program, the results of the program, the training of the people in the program were valid. That is an important thing when you go seeking money or funds from other places. How do you know it works? 3 years of study came up with the validation of, hey, this does work. It should be spread. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, 1980s, I forgot, sorry. I don't know if any of you have heard of ADAPT, but ADAPT was the Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. They were formed out of the Atlanta community, and they had a big action at the APTA conference in the early 1980s. And in a report called Toward Independence, the National Council on the Handicapped, again, this is old language, I'm using the language of the time period, documented discrimination against people with disabilities. That was a federal report documenting discrimination existed, and it was a problem. The Air Carrier Access Act was passed, saying you had to start to think about passengers who have disabilities. They have equal rights too. And there was a huge demonstration in 1988, I think, about Gallaudet University. They had always, that is the university specifically for individuals who are deaf, hard of hearing. A wonderful institution. They do wonderful things, and they've been around since Abraham Lincoln. They were angry when the new president was named, and it was not a person who was deaf. It was a huge demonstration that went on for days. If any of you see photos of the demonstrations of students at Columbia University in the 70s, the anti-war demonstration, this one at Gallaudet looked just like them. They had a major, major demonstration that went on for days, and guess what? They won. They absolutely demanded and said there are sufficient number of people who are deaf who are qualified, more than qualified, because of their intimate knowledge of what it means to be deaf, to run our university. We don't need somebody else telling us how we should do it. So they won. That was very big. Now, that was only 2 years before the ADA. Also, going through Congress at this time were bills that were the forerunners of the ADA on disability rights. There was a Supreme Court case that ADAPT brought against the federal government. And the court found out that the federal regulations that limited the amount of money a transit system had to spend on access. There was a 3% cap. You didn't have to spend more than 3% to make your system accessible. That they were arbitrary and discriminatory regulations, and they were struck down. Can you imagine if our transit systems today only had to spend no more than 3% on making everything accessible? Be a big problem. And Easter Seals Project Action came into being at that time. What was going on in travel training? Well, the St. Paul Public Schools, Minnesota's St. Paul Public Schools, started travel training, and they started it with a graduate from the University of Wisconsin program that dealt with O&Ms. An example of the programs funded by OMRDD was in Michigan, the Wayne County Association for the Retarded initiated travel training and developed a mobility training curriculum. Again, this was patterned more after the O&M practices than it was on others, even though they did move further away from just the O&M. In the middle of the 1980s, the Delaware County Intermediate Unit in Pennsylvania initiated travel training with one instructor. And there was a woman called Katie Simpson. I don't know if any of you who are participants know her or know what happened to her. But boy, did she do a lot in making travel training known to people. She did a lot in trying to help people set up travel training and to train personnel and to do things. She was very active in the 80s and for a large part of the 90s. Paratransit Inc. from Sacramento, California, started in the late 1980s or middle 1980s. And to a certain extent, they did some of the, I won't say to a certain extent, it was to a great extent, they did a whole lot of the emphasis on including seniors in the practice of travel training. They have to be given credit for that because they were very vocal on it and it was legitimate. Going back to the early 1980s, in 1980, as a result of a 1979 lawsuit that was brought against the New York City Transit, and I think one against SEPTA, by Eastern Paralyzed Veterans requiring accessible vehicles be purchased to replace buses that were going out, and also the concept of key stations. You know that concept, key stations? That's where it came from. And so they were doing that. And in 1980, I think the first sensitivity training film for a transit system's bus operators was initiated in New York City. So it was, a lot was going on. There were demands being made. But what about travel training demands? They were not as loud. It was starting to get loud. I don't know of all of them, but one of the reasons why it was not as loud as it could have been goes back to the 60s and the 70s. Funding finally came in to the offices for people with developmental disabilities and mental retardation, and there was a growth in door-to-door busing to programs. The public school law also provided busing. An interesting aside, in New York City, a study was done in looking at the changes in people agreeing to travel training and those not agreeing to travel training for their sons and daughters. Before busing became widely established through the Federal Education for All Handicapped Children Act, the majority of parents who refused travel training for those with mild to moderate mental retardation refused because they had already taught their kids to travel. By 1979, it had changed, and the majority who refused because they wanted school busing, having nothing to do with ability. So there is a double-edged sword, but I think people who do travel training have to be aware of how do you look at things, what does it mean? Next slide. 1990s, let us celebrate. I guess you're all familiar with pictures of the Capitol crawl in March of 1990. Boy, that was a big thing that led directly to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, Title II and now Title III were the big ones that the disability community were able to focus on immediately, and that was how do you get transportation accessible. Project Action was very, very active at this time in helping with that. It was an essential arm of Congress to build a bridge between the disability community and the transportation community to increase access to public transportation and to make public transportation more available to all people with disabilities. It was at this time, there was a couple of years study on the concept of detectable warning strips in subway stations, and people forget there was a real war that went on around that with meetings for a couple of years in which we were discussing, do they impede people who use wheelchairs or walkers or crutches? What is the size, the distance, the height, the color? How do they help those, why they are essential for those with visual limitations? And of course, we know that they can be very, very useful for anyone with a cognitive impairment because, or seniors, the more ways you have of getting information, the better off you are. In 1997, the education law came in again, and it was renamed to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, following the ADA. And they added transition and travel training. Now that directly affects us in our field. Travel training was listed under the definition of special education. It was specifically not included under related services. Remember, related services follow more of a medical model. Travel training follows more of a social and independent living model. And it would have gotten very murky had it been under something else. Also, what happened was Olmsted case in the Supreme Court that emphasized the need and the right of people with mental and cognitive disabilities to live in the most integrated setting possible, and that was in the community. That should have opened up a whole lot of activity for travel training and independent travel, and in some places it may have, but in other places it may have increased the request for paratransit. It is really important to consider that the impetus of the disability rights movement has been much more towards control over your own lives. And we have not come into a good way of dealing with the whole paratransit operation so that there is back and forth movement easily between independent travel, supported travel, paratransit travel, etc. There's still a lot of work we have to do on that. Now, Easter Seals Project Action in the 90s and 2000s was a very busy bee. It was doing everything. It funded a lot of programs in school districts to demonstrate, and I know that in New York City there were about a number of programs funded to demonstrate how it could work in high schools. How can you include high school kids, particularly those with physical disabilities, in travel training? How do you work with transit to be sure? And there were many mutual and mutually beneficial funding projects which allowed people who were doing travel training with primarily developmentally disabled individuals and hearing impaired individuals to really work closely with the transit systems in expanding programs, services, operations, and practices of both to be able to include those who use mobility devices. It was incredible. And they also did a lot of funding with adult service provider agencies. Everybody was excited in the 1990s. The law was just passed. Let us do something. Let us get it together. The biggest thing was probably transit agencies and travel training. Prior to that, ADA, forget about it. If there were any, it was so limited, you didn't know about them. But after the ADA, and they had initially thought, and some of you out there know this and may have even worked with some of the organizations, that transit properties thought that we'll just use paratransit, we'll set it up. That'll be easy. And they went around trying to do that. They quickly found out it was killing them in terms of cost. So a number of the transit systems started their own travel training programs and or contracted with others, which then sprang up to meet the demand. So travel training began to change from more of a developmentally disabled, hard of hearing, deaf training activity to ones that included a wider range of disabilities and went from being in schools and adult service provider agencies to a large number being transit-related agencies. That is a very significant shift, very significant. Senior programs began to get very, very interested because seniors had to give up driving. AARP got interested in the early 2000s. Demonstrating the interest of transit were two seminars given, one in 95 and one in 97 at the University of Wisconsin, I think it was in Madison, to train people and to introduce travel training. They were 2 or 3 day seminars. And most of the audience, as I think about it, were people from transit properties. They were not people from adult service agencies or school systems. That shift had been complete. It was gone. In 1997, Project Action funded Western Michigan University to develop personnel programs, preparation programs for travel trainers, and to come up with competencies for them. Bill Weiner was the guy who got the project in charge, and he was the head of the O&M department or blind rehabilitation department at WMU, and he and I worked together and to come up with a grant for this. And there were 4 organizations, 4 sites chosen or selected to participate in this project. One was the Minneapolis-St. Paul program, where the person who had first started there had gone to the program at Wisconsin. Both of the travel instructors in that program were O&Ms who also provided travel training to students with other disabilities. The OMRDD unit in Akron, Ohio, that was a participant. The single instructor program at Delaware Intermediate Unit in Pennsylvania was part of it, and New York City Department of Education travel training was part of it. It turns out that more of the time and more of the people who were on the advisory committee spent more time in New York City than elsewhere, and that is probably due to the fact that there were so many more people doing travel training, so many more people being travel trained, that it was easier to have them all in one place and then able to talk. But each of the 4 programs was visited, and the way they did it, the documentation of their training, the documentation of their personnel preparation, the looking at the way they kept records, all of these were done with all 4 sites. Near the end at the completion of the program, in 1999, I believe it was the first National Travel Training Conference in Kalamazoo as part of the Project Action grant. Next slide. Busy decade. Then we come into the new century. And boy, we had disability pride parades that went on in the 90s. They continued in 2000s. We now have disability studies programs at the universities and PhDs. And the disability community, giving up any euphoria from passing the ADA, realized they need to maintain continuous vigilance, especially in healthcare, housing, transportation, employment, education, community, and technology. Really important to continue the vigilance to be sure that we don't slip back. There were an enormous number of lawsuits because after the ADA was passed in the 1990s and early 2000s, the courts were chipping away at the definition of disability and who could be covered under it. And in 2008, they amended the ADA to try to reinforce who would be covered under it. Philosophy, again, is an important part of everything. It's who knows best about what. Who is supposed to say they are the experts in what a person with a disability needs? Is it a professional who took courses at a university? Is it a person with a disability who has experienced what it is like? How do you model these things? One of the issues, particularly in healthcare and in education, is that, in my opinion, this is Peggy's opinion, professionals do not know how to directly address the issue of either a child with a disability or just talking to the person with a disability about their disability. There is a lack of comfort and ease and openness in talking about it, particularly when it comes to the area of cognitive and mental disabilities. It is not an easy conversation for many to have. And that goes into the philosophy of the rehab model. Are we still rehabilitating? Under the law, under IDEA, we still have the medical model in related services where we're doing therapy. And we still talk about trying to fix. For those on the autism spectrum, you very frequently hear about treatments when they are really talking about education. So these are issues that, as people, we in the field of travel training, we have to be cognizant of. The Association of Travel Instruction was officially incorporated, I think, in 2001. It was incorporated initially in the state of Michigan and then reincorporated in the state of Delaware. It was very exciting. It was the first association of travel instruction anywhere. And it soon showed that there was a difference in philosophy regarding personnel preparation and the competencies for the practice of travel instruction and travel training, which had been part of the WMU grant with Project Action. There were those who felt that travel training should be more like O&M, requiring at minimum of a bachelor's degree and training through a university and certification through a professional organization, and that to do travel training. The original grant had not made that distinction. So it had said there are travel trainers who do not have these degrees. They are doing the job. They are well prepared. What is the best way for preparation? Now, this calls into mind that within the field of orientation and mobility, there were two strands. There was the National Federation of the Blind and the American Council for the Blind and the Association for the Education and Rehabilitation of Blind and Visually Impaired. The AER program went with developing an organization, like an academy, to do certification. And that was through all of their college preparation programs. The National Federation of the Blind has been based in the idea that we're blind. What do you mean we cannot do the training? We can certainly do the training, because the practice had been you could not attend an O&M course if you were blind or visually impaired. You had to have sight to teach O&M. Well, the NFB programs demonstrated their competency. They have their own certification that is not as much based on the academic preparation of the other organization. This type of split occurred in the Association of Travel Instruction and among people in travel training. And there was a split in ATI, and a group went off and formed Consortium for the Education and Advancement of Travel Instruction. They follow much more directly the need for all the academic preparation that the O&M COMS model did. Association of Travel Instruction at this time still seems to rely more, if you were going to pick any of that, more on the social model, independent living model, the NFB model, of other types of certification or training or preparing. ATI started a whole program of continuing education. That is the purpose of the webinars. That is the purpose of the conferences. But there are issues in our history we have not yet addressed. The split that occurred between the transit agencies and the other people doing travel training. And I think if you looked at CEATI and ATI, you would see some of that inherent in their membership. And it is something to consider and to think about, that many people do travel training. Who are they? How are they trained? What are they doing? How can we work together? It still needs recognition as a distinct profession. The Americans with Disabilities Act does not indicate it as a distinct profession. Because of the lack of recognition that travel training gets, there is no legislation that directly relates to it, and there is no funding that directly goes to travel training. For example, in New York State, at the state level, the Commissioner for the Blind will fund directly O&M for an individual who is blind. There is no such compatible funding for an individual with a disability other than blindness who needs travel training. So our history is constantly evolving. It cannot be separated from the whole disability community. And we have to try to always reach out and reach across and to recognize that what is happening out there is going to impact directly on who does the work we do, how is the work viewed, what can we look at. We don't have, as an association, as a profession, we have not established the type of connections that were established in the 1960s and 1970s when people reached out. To this day, transportation and the ability to use it is a major, major barrier to full participation in the life of the community, into education, into employment, into different housing options for people with a wide range of disabilities. And I think somehow or other, the fact that travel training is not recognized as a distinct profession with its own history, its own philosophy, its own competencies and requirements, that it is not driven by a medical or rehabilitation model, but more as an independent living, education, instruction, wherever you get it model, is very important for us, and we have to start to think about looking at it. In doing that, and in taking away the fear, many people still have fears of travel training for family members who have significant disabilities. Part of that fear is the lack of recognition, the lack of publishing that we have as to what is successful, why is it successful, how many are successful, how long do they travel, what are the training, what are the skills and competencies. That goes back to the booklet, Competencies for the Practice of Travel Instruction and Travel Training. Some of them were based, and it's obvious when you look at them and you look at the O&M competencies, were based on the O&M model. They are more in the academic preparation section of the competencies than in the operational practice section. What is necessary and what is not? I think that's where we have to go. But I don't think we can go there unless we know how we got to where we are. Again, as I said at the beginning, nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. So I think it's really, really important to know where we came from, why we came from there, how did we evolve in order for us to have any say in where we're going, how we're going to get there, and who's going to help us. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was a lot of information, a lot of really great information, and I'm sure that that everyone will agree with me that that was a fantastic presentation. I just want to remind everybody how you can ask your questions. We did have a general admin question come in, and I addressed that during the session, but you can ask your question either through the Q&A box on the webinar room, or in the chat section. You can send a message. I'm monitoring both of those and we'll be happy to present your question to Peggy once you submit that. Just a couple of comments while I give everybody a moment to submit their question. I'm going to go ahead and put up Peggy's last slide just so that you have this information as well. One quick comment about Peggy's presentation. It's obvious when you listen to the presentation and you see the information on the slides that Peggy has a lot of experience and a lot of years and commitment to travel training and to building this amount of information in this particular presentation. And so what we're going to ask is if you would like to use any piece of the presentation, that you please obtain express consent from Peggy prior to doing that. So she has provided her email address, and you are welcome to connect with her if you would like to use any piece of the presentation, and you can have that conversation and figure out how to move forward. So, with that request, I'm going to go back and take a quick look here and see what questions we have. We have a comment from Kristen that says, just wanted to say it was an awesome presentation. I love how you showed the history of the disability rights movement alongside with the history of travel training. The two are so intertwined. And so that was a really great comment. Thank you, Kristen. All right, I don't see any questions coming in, but Peggy, if you'll indulge me, I have a question that I would like for you to talk about, if you don't mind. I know that you mentioned at the end that one of the big topics moving forward is going to be addressing the competencies and figuring out how those fit in with the profession currently. I'm wondering if there are other areas that you think travel training, the profession in general, or even more specifically ATI needs to think about in the coming 10 years, you know, or what are your big red hot topic ideas that you think that the association needs to think about?
I think the association needs to, and for any people who are in the audience, it's really important to look at law cases and legislation. Because when they are going to amend a piece of legislation, there should be a voice that talks about the absolute need. If you are going to speak about community participation, if you're going to speak about independent living, if you're going to talk about employment, if you're going to talk about the right to be able to live spontaneously, to be at a college, say, and then to want to go out with friends afterwards. If you are reliant on paratransit, it will not. It has to be, there has to be some way of having that looked at. There needs to be people who want to do this. I think that's the most important thing, to get groups. I know that ATI has committees, and I think that's very important. And I think that to have the committees help the field move and grow, we need to have people participate on the committees. You don't have to agree. I think differences of opinion are fine. It's just that you have to voice your difference, listen to what somebody else has to say, and move on from there. Because pragmatically, no one thing is always right. There'll always be ways that you have to move together. And I do think a lot of people talk about O&M and travel training merging. I don't think anyone is near ready for that yet.
Right.
Without either profession giving up an awful lot. And that the people that we serve losing a lot. I think the most important thing that we have to do, or one of the most important things, is to get our heads on straight about how we think. Because once you have a thought, and this goes back to the disability models, every single one of those models exists in our thinking today. And we have to consider how that impacts the decisions we make and who we include. When Jack Gorelick was starting travel training with people who were listed as having IQs basically well below 45, all the professionals, just about all of the professionals in New York City, at the universities, in medicine, etc., said he was crazy. There was one gentleman who did not, a renowned professor at Columbia, Ignacy Goldberg, who said, yeah, why not? Go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Had he listened to the others, it would not have happened. And I think my sense today is we have slipped back a little bit too far into the thinking of doing for, taking care of, nurturing, providing services that were very symptomatic of the rehab and medical models, rather than saying you have to take a chance. In the 60s, there rose a philosophy, dignity of risk, for those of you who have heard of it. Robert Persky wrote about it. And it talked about that if people don't take a chance, if you don't have the right to take a risk, you're being denied an opportunity to live what is considered a normal life. We all take chances. How many of us take a chance on a stock we buy? That's a risk. How many of us take a chance? You take a chance every time you do anything. But when you deny people the chance, that is the problem. And I think if travel training is going to mean anything for the future, for all of the people who may at some point require it, it has to keep sort of as a mantra, there is a dignity of risk. And part of that is being able to get out there and control your movements on your own call.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Peggy. I appreciate you taking the time to indulge me with that question. We did have a couple of additional questions come in. One of them I'm going to quickly address, and then the other one I will present to you for your thoughts. The first one is on the availability of resources, and it says, do you possibly have a list of resources to help learn more about travel training? This is the question I'll just really briefly take a stab at and say that there is a members only section on the ATI website. So if you are an ATI member, you can access that. There are some resources there now, as well as past conference presentations and past year's webinar recordings. So those are available to you. One of the things that the Professional Development Committee is working on this year is talking about how we can provide more resources to the members. And so I would look for, in the coming months, some additional information on how we might be making that happen. And so you can start at the members only site right now, and then hopefully within the next coming several months, we'll have a lot more information available for you with regard to resources that you can tap into. With that, Peggy, we did have a question on technology that I absolutely can't wait to hear what your thoughts are. But this is a question from Stacy, and it says, thank you for the incredible history of travel training. What role should or shouldn't technology play in the future of travel instruction?
Hi, Stacy. Hope you're doing well. Technology has always been around. It is nothing new. It is always changing. It has always created changes. So it has played and will continue to play a role in travel instruction. What it should not do is to be used for someone. We should not be teaching someone, spending our time in travel instruction, teaching someone how to use a device instead of teaching them how to do something. There is a tendency to want to follow a pattern of using something that will say, your stop is coming up, ring the bell, stand up, get off your stop, walk to this. That's fine when it works, but that's not teaching someone how to think, how to solve a problem, how to use the device as a prosthetic to assist them rather than to direct them. So I think the challenge is, how do we use technology as assistive rather than directive? Because technology is incredible. It is absolutely essential. But I can tell you, if I go to follow it all the time blindly, I get lost. And I think we think about it as an all or nothing situation, and it isn't. I mean, we always use telephones. That was technology. Now it's a cell phone or a smartphone. We have always used systems, and so we will continue to use systems. I think travel trainers have to be actively involved in what is the technology that will assist me in this person learning how to be out there alone in the community with the assistance of this type of thing, rather than relying on it totally, if that makes any sense.
Yes, I definitely think that makes sense, and I think I would agree with you wholeheartedly on that thought. So, and as technology improves and evolves, you know, I think that your approach of it doesn't have to be everything. You know, don't rely solely on that is a really important concept to keep in mind as well. Peggy, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think that we're good to wrap up the session for the afternoon. Before I make a couple of closing comments, so I wanted to see if you had anything that you wanted to say before we end the session.
I thank you for attending, and I have a terrible tendency to put too much in something, so I'm sorry if I did that for you. But if you do want any information about a particular area, please feel free to contact me.
All right, thank you so much, Peggy. I don't think it was too much information. I think everything was fantastic, and I thank you again for your time and the time in putting this presentation together. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, please consider, if you're not currently an ATI member, please consider signing up for the upcoming year, which starts in January. We are going to be issuing some additional resources and new information that's coming out of the Professional Development Committee that we're very excited about. So stay tuned for that. Should you have any questions or need additional information on the Association of Travel Instruction, you can email us at info@travelinstruction.org, or you can obviously check out the website and find some additional information there. So thank you very much on behalf of ATI and the rest of the ATI board. We appreciate your participation today. Thank you, Peggy, for your time and presentation. And we hope that everybody has a really great day. Thank you so much.